The sound of a whispered slur cut through the warm afternoon air like a knife, and Victoria Winters felt the sting of it against her cheek, as though it had been a physical blow. "Two-time widow," the woman hissed to her companion as Victoria passed by on the dusty main street of Copper Creek, Colorado. It was 1878, and in this frontier town, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, a woman who had buried 2 husbands before her 30th birthday was either cursed or dangerous, perhaps both. Victoria kept her head high, though her gloved hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the modest black bonnet that shaded her face from both the sun and the judgmental stares of the townsfolk. The weight of her mourning clothes felt especially heavy today, despite the fact that it had been nearly a year since she had buried Thomas, her second husband. Her first, William, had been gone for almost 4 years now. She had arrived in Copper Creek just 3 months prior, hoping for a fresh start where her past might not follow so closely at her heels. But news traveled fast along the stagecoach routes, and whispers had a way of outpacing even the swiftest horses. The general store bell chimed as Victoria pushed open the door, grateful for the momentary respite from the scrutiny of the street. Mr. Goldsmith, the proprietor, offered her a polite but distant nod from behind the counter. At least he was willing to take her money, even if he wasn't eager to engage in friendly conversation. "Just the usual supplies today, Mr. Goldsmith," Victoria said, her voice soft but steady as she placed her list on the counter. "Of course, Mrs. Winters," he replied, taking the list with the tips of his fingers as though her widowhood might be contagious. "I'll have the boy deliver them to your place this afternoon." Victoria nodded her thanks, her green eyes carefully neutral despite the familiar ache in her chest. She had hoped that time would soften the town's reception. But if anything, the whispers had only grown more frequent. As Mr. Goldsmith began to gather her items, the bell above the door jangled again. Victoria didn't turn, accustomed to keeping to herself, but she felt the shift in the air as someone tall stepped into the store. "Afternoon, Jake," Mr. Goldsmith called out, his voice warming considerably. "Got that order of nails and wire fencing you were looking for?" "Appreciate it, Samuel," came the reply, the voice deep and resonant with a hint of a Texas drawl. "Been waiting on those fence posts for near 2 weeks. Ranch hands are starting to think I made up the whole idea of fixing the north pasture line." Victoria couldn't help but glance sideways at the newcomer. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist. His dark brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jawline. Dust from the trail clung to his denim trousers and cotton shirt, and the leather of his boots was scuffed from hard use. A cowboy, then, and one who worked his land rather than merely owning it. He must have felt her gaze, for he turned toward her, tipping his hat with a sun-browned hand. "Madam," he acknowledged, and Victoria noted the clear blue of his eyes, startling against his tanned skin. "Mr. McCord's got the biggest spread north of town," Mr. Goldsmith offered, seemingly eager to facilitate introductions to this particular customer. "The Diamondback Ranch. Best cattle in the territory." The cowboy McCord gave a modest shrug. "We do all right." Victoria offered a polite nod in return. "Mr. McCord," she said simply, expecting the conversation to end there. Most men in town made it a point to avoid extended interaction with her once they learned her story. "Jake McCord, madam," he corrected, extending his hand in greeting. Victoria hesitated only briefly before accepting it. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip firm without being overbearing. "Victoria Winters," she replied, withdrawing her hand perhaps a bit too quickly. She noticed the slight tightening around Mr. Goldsmith's eyes, and knew what would come next: the subtle warning, the unspoken communication between men that would signal her status as someone to be avoided. Mrs. Winters just moved into the old Peterson place a few months back, Goldsmith said, right on cue, his emphasis on Mrs. unmistakable. McCord's expression didn't change. That's a fine piece of land. Good water source. The orchard still producing. The question, directed at her rather than Goldsmith, caught Victoria by surprise. Yes, she answered. The apple trees are quite prolific, though I fear many will go to waste. It's more than I can manage on my own. Shame to waste good fruit, McCord said. I'd be happy to send a couple of hands over come harvest time. They work for apples and cider. A smile creased the corners of his eyes, genuine and unguarded. Before Victoria could respond, Goldsmith cleared his throat. Mrs. Winters is, recently widowed, Jake. He paused meaningfully. For the second time. The silence that followed felt interminable to Victoria. She steeled herself for the familiar shift, the subtle withdrawal, the hasty excuses, the awkward departure that inevitably followed this revelation. But Jake McCord's blue eyes never wavered from hers. That just means you're strong enough for me, Mrs. Winters, he said simply, as though commenting on the weather. Surviving once is hard enough. Twice shows a special kind of grit. This territory needs more of that, not less. Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused to such direct acknowledgement of her circumstances without judgment attached. I thank you, Mr. McCord, she managed, finding herself momentarily at a loss for words. Jake, he corrected again, with that same easy smile. And my offer stands about the orchard. Be ashamed to let those apples rot on the branch. Mr. Goldsmith looked between them with poorly concealed surprise, clearly expecting a different reaction from the rancher. He busied himself with Victoria's order, muttering something about checking the storeroom for sugar. I'll consider it, Victoria said when she found her voice again, though I wouldn't want to impose. No imposition. My men work hard. They eat harder. Fresh fruit's a luxury we don't often see. Jake leaned slightly against the counter, relaxed in a way that few people were in her presence these days. How are you finding Copper Creek otherwise? The simple question, asked with genuine interest, nearly undid her careful composure. How long had it been since someone had inquired about her welfare without an ulterior motive? It's beautiful country, she answered carefully, though I'm still becoming acquainted with the town itself. Something in her tone must have conveyed more than her words, for Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Small towns have long memories and quick judgments, he observed, but they can come around, given time and reason. Victoria doubted that very much, but she appreciated the sentiment. Perhaps, she conceded. Mr. Goldsmith returned with her parcels wrapped in brown paper and twine. That'll be $1.68, Mrs. Winters. Victoria opened her reticule and counted out the coins, laying them precisely on the counter. Thank you, Mr. Goldsmith. I'll be heading your direction when I leave town, Jake said as she gathered her small purchases. I'd be happy to give you a ride back to your place, save you the walk in this heat. The offer was tempting. The 2-mile walk back to her small homestead would be uncomfortable in the afternoon sun, especially in her dark morning clothes. But accepting would undoubtedly set tongues wagging even more vigorously than they already were. That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you, she demurred. No inconvenience, Jake insisted. I've got business out that way regardless, and my horse could use the easy pace after the ride into town. Victoria hesitated, weighing propriety against practicality. If you're certain it's no trouble. None at all, Jake assured her. I'll meet you outside when you're ready. As he turned to complete his own transaction with Goldsmith, Victoria gathered her purchases and stepped back onto the boardwalk. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and she found herself silently grateful for Jake's offer, regardless of what the town might say. When Jake emerged from the store minutes later, he carried his supplies to a wagon hitched near the water trough. A magnificent black gelding stood patiently in the traces, occasionally swishing its tail at flies. "This is Midnight," Jake said, noticing her admiring the horse. "Best cow pony I ever had before he took a hoof to the shoulder last spring. Retired him to wagon duty after that." Victoria approached the horse cautiously, extending her hand for the animal to sniff. "He's beautiful." "And he knows it," Jake chuckled, loading his purchases into the wagon bed. "Ready when you are, Mrs. Winters." He helped her up onto the seat with a strong hand at her elbow, then circled around to take his place beside her. With a gentle click of his tongue and a light touch of the reins, Jake set Midnight in motion. As they rolled down the main street, Victoria was acutely aware of the stares that followed them. Mrs. Henderson and her sewing circle watched openly from the steps of the church. The blacksmith paused in his work, hammer suspended in mid-air. Even Sheriff Dawson, smoking his pipe outside his office, raised his eyebrows at the sight. "You've certainly given them something to talk about," Victoria murmured, keeping her gaze fixed ahead. Jake shrugged. "Let them talk. Not much else to do in a town this size." The casual dismissal of Copper Creek's gossip machine was refreshing, if naive. "They can make life difficult," Victoria said, "especially for newcomers." "Been here 8 years, Jake replied. "Still consider myself a newcomer by their standards. Doesn't bother me much." They passed the last buildings at the edge of town, and Victoria felt herself relaxing slightly as they continued onto the rutted dirt road that led toward her property. "May I ask?" Jake began after they had traveled in comfortable silence for several minutes. "What brought you to Copper Creek?" "It's not exactly on the main routes." Victoria considered deflecting the question, as had become her habit, but something about Jake's straightforward manner encouraged honesty. "A fresh start," she admitted, "and the property was affordable for a woman on her own." Jake nodded, as though this made perfect sense to him. "Best reason to come west. Fresh starts are what this territory was built on. Though some pasts are harder to leave behind than others," Victoria said, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. "True enough," Jake agreed, guiding Midnight around a particularly deep rut in the road. "Mind if I ask about your husbands? Only if you're comfortable speaking of them," he added quickly. The question was direct but not unkindly meant. Victoria found herself answering. "William was a banker in St. Louis. We married when I was 19. He was a good deal older, 45. He died of a heart condition after 3 years of marriage." She paused, remembering the kind but distant man who had given her security if not passion. "Thomas was different. A lawyer closer to my age. We moved to Denver after we married. He contracted tuberculosis last year." Jake was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "I'm sorry for your losses," he said finally, and Victoria was struck by the sincerity in his voice. There was no undertone of suspicion, no hint that he found the deaths unusual or her somehow responsible. "Thank you," she said simply. "No children?" he asked gently. Victoria shook her head. "No, it wasn't to be." The familiar ache of that particular loss throbbed dully beneath her ribs. They crested a small rise, and Victoria's property came into view below. The modest farmhouse stood surrounded by the apple orchard, the trees already heavy with small green fruit that would ripen come fall. A chicken coop and small barn completed the homestead, along with a kitchen garden that Victoria had expanded since her arrival. "You've done good work here," Jake observed, genuine admiration in his tone. Place was falling apart when old Peterson left. It keeps me busy, Victoria said. And I've always found physical work to be healing in its way. Jake guided the wagon up the narrow track to her house and drew midnight to a halt in the yard. I understand that, he said, setting the brake. Ranch work's been my salvation more times than I can count. He jumped down from the wagon seat and came around to help Victoria descend. His hands at her waist were strong and sure, lifting her down with effortless grace. For a moment, they stood close enough that Victoria could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, close enough to catch the scent of leather and horse and clean sweat that clung to him. He stepped back first, releasing her and retrieving her packages from the wagon bed. "Where would you like these? The porch is fine," Victoria said, feeling oddly flustered. "I can manage from there." Jake carried the parcels to her front porch and set them carefully beside the door. "That offer about the orchard stands," he said, turning back to her. "No strings attached. Just neighbors helping neighbors." Victoria found herself smiling, a genuine expression that felt unfamiliar on her face after so many months of careful, polite masks. "I'd appreciate the help when the time comes," she said. "Thank you." Jake tipped his hat, that easy smile returning. "My pleasure, Mrs. Winters." "Victoria," she corrected, surprising herself. "If I'm to call you Jake." "Victoria," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "Until next time, then." As he drove away, Victoria remained on her porch, watching until the wagon disappeared over the rise. For the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, she felt something other than resignation settling in her chest. It felt strangely like hope. The following Sunday found Victoria sitting alone in the last pew of Copper Creek's only church, as had become her custom. Reverend Simmons preached passionately about the prodigal son, but Victoria found her attention wandering, her gaze drifting to the stained glass windows where dust motes danced in the colored light. She had not seen Jake McCord since their encounter at the general store 5 days earlier, though she had thought of him more often than was entirely proper, perhaps. There was something about his straightforward manner and the kindness in his eyes that had stayed with her, a warm memory amid the cool reception she typically received in town. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Victoria's voice joined the others softly, the familiar words of Amazing Grace rising to the rafters. When the service concluded, she remained seated as others filed out, preferring to avoid the stilted socializing that took place on the church steps. "Mrs. Winters." Victoria looked up, startled to find Reverend Simmons standing beside her pew, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Reverend," she acknowledged, rising to her feet. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his expression kind if somewhat distant. "It cannot be easy being new to our community, especially in your circumstances." "You're very thoughtful," Victoria replied carefully. "I'm managing well enough." The Reverend nodded. "God tests those he loves most severely, Mrs. Winters. Your trials have been significant for one so young." Before Victoria could respond to this dubious comfort, the Reverend continued, lowering his voice slightly. "I feel I should mention as your spiritual advisor that appearances matter greatly in a small community such as ours." Victoria felt her spine stiffen. "I'm not certain I take your meaning, Reverend. Several parishioners mentioned seeing you riding with Jacob McCord earlier this week," he explained, his tone gentle but admonishing. "While I'm sure it was entirely innocent, a widow, particularly one in your position, must be especially careful of her reputation." The implication stung, though Victoria had expected something of the sort. "Mr. McCord was kind enough to offer me a ride home after I completed my errands in town," she said evenly. It was a neighborly gesture, nothing more, of course. Reverend Simmons nodded. I merely thought to caution you. Jacob is well respected as a rancher, but he keeps to himself. Somewhat unorthodox in his ways. Not a regular churchgoer, I'm afraid. This last was delivered with a significant look that Victoria chose to ignore. Thank you for your concern, she said, gathering her hymnal and prayer book. If you'll excuse me, Reverend. She moved past him toward the door, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will. Outside, the church steps had mostly cleared, though a few clusters of parishioners remained, their conversation dropping to whispers as Victoria emerged. She had just reached the bottom step when she heard her name called. Turning, she was surprised to see Martha Jenkins hurrying toward her, a covered basket in hand. Martha was the milliner's wife, a plump, pleasant woman who had never been overtly unkind to Victoria, though neither had she been particularly welcoming. Mrs. Winters, Martha said, slightly breathless. I was hoping to catch you before you left, Mrs. Jenkins, Victoria replied, curious despite herself. I made too many preserves last season, Martha explained, holding out the basket. My husband claims he'll turn into a peach if he has to eat any more. I thought you might enjoy some, being on your own and all. The unexpected kindness caught Victoria off guard. That's very thoughtful of you, she said, accepting the basket. Are you certain you can spare them? Absolutely, Martha insisted. And there's some of my sourdough starter in there too, if you've a mind for baking. It's been going strong for 15 years now. Thank you, Victoria said, genuinely touched. This is most generous. Martha lowered her voice, glancing around. Don't you mind what they say, she said unexpectedly. Lost my first husband to the influenza back in '61. Wasn't even 25. Folk can be cruel when they don't understand something. Before Victoria could respond to this surprising show of solidarity, Martha had patted her arm and hurried away to join her second husband, who waited by their wagon. Thoughtful, Victoria began the walk home, the basket of preserves a welcome weight on her arm. Perhaps not everyone in Copper Creek was as judgmental as she had feared. She had gone about half a mile when the sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. Stepping to the side of the road, Victoria turned to see Jake McCord atop a chestnut stallion with a white blaze. He slowed as he neared her, the horse prancing slightly beneath him. Mrs. Winters, he called, genuine pleasure in his voice. Victoria, he corrected himself, reining the spirited horse to a stop beside her. Mr. McCord, she returned, unable to keep a small smile from her lips. I didn't see you at the service this morning. Jake grinned, unrepentant. I find God more readily under the open sky than inside four walls, he admitted. Though I try not to mention that to Reverend Simmons. Man's determined to save my heathen soul. Victoria laughed despite herself, the sound rusty from disuse. He mentioned you were unorthodox in your ways. Did he now? Jake's eyes twinkled with amusement. And here I thought I was being so discreet about my wicked ways. Terribly wicked, offering rides to stranded widows and help with apple harvests, Victoria agreed, her tone lightly teasing. The ease of their banter surprised her. It had been so long since she had engaged in such casual conversation. Jake swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. Allow me to compound my wickedness by walking with you, he offered, leading the stallion by the reins. This is Thunder, by the way. Best cutting horse in the territory, though he's got an ego to match his talent. The horse snorted, as if in agreement, and Victoria found herself laughing again. I'm beginning to think all your animals have personalities as distinct as their names. Every last one, Jake confirmed. Makes life interesting. He nodded toward her basket. Successful shopping trip, a gift actually, Victoria explained, from Mrs. Jenkins. peach preserves and sourdough starter. Martha Jenkins. Jake looked surprised. Well, that's something. Her preserves are legendary in these parts. She must have taken a liking to you. Victoria's expression turned thoughtful. She mentioned losing her first husband young. I think perhaps she understands something of my situation. Jake nodded. Makes sense. Once folks find common ground, barriers tend to fall. Not everyone in Copper Creek is quick to judge, though it might seem that way at first. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, the only sounds the rhythmic clip of thunder's hooves and the calls of meadowlarks in the adjacent fields. I was sorry to hear about your husbands, Jake said after a time, his tone respectful. Losing someone you love leaves marks that don't easily fade. Victoria glanced at him, struck by the note of personal understanding in his voice. You speak as if from experience, she observed quietly. Jake was silent for several strides. My wife, Rebecca, he finally said. 7 years ago now, childbirth fever, lost her and the baby both. I'm so sorry, Victoria said, the simple words inadequate for the depth of such loss. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Bought the ranch after. Needed something to pour myself into, something that required all my strength and attention, day and night. I understand that completely, Victoria said softly. After Thomas died, I couldn't bear to stay in our home in Denver. Every corner held memories. I needed somewhere new, somewhere that demanded I focus on the present rather than the past. And is it working? Jake asked, his blue eyes finding hers. This fresh start of yours, Victoria considered the question seriously. Some days more than others, she admitted. The work helps. The physical exhaustion makes it easier to sleep without. She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about revealing so much. Without seeing their faces when you close your eyes, Jake finished for her. Without hearing their voices in the quiet moments. Yes, Victoria whispered, a lump forming in her throat at being so completely understood. They had reached the turn that led to her property. Jake stopped, his expression serious now. Victoria, he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. I've enjoyed talking with you. If you'd permit it, I'd like to call on you properly sometime. The request, so formal and yet so direct, caught her by surprise. Call on me, she repeated, uncertain. For dinner, perhaps, Jake clarified, or just conversation, no pressure or expectations. Just two people who understand something about loss, getting to know one another better. Victoria hesitated, conscious of Reverend Simmons' warning about appearances, yet drawn to the genuine warmth in Jake's manner. I think I would like that, she said finally. Though I should warn you, the town already disapproves of our brief association. Jake's smile returned, though tempered with seriousness. I've never much cared for other people's opinions of my private affairs, he said. But I understand if you need to be more cautious, given your situation. No, Victoria decided, surprising herself with her own certainty. No, I think I've been cautious enough. Dinner would be lovely, Jake. His smile broadened. Wednesday, I could come by around 6 if that suits you. Wednesday at 6, Victoria confirmed, a flutter of nervous anticipation stirring in her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in a very long time. Jake mounted thunder with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. Until Wednesday, then, he said, tipping his hat. Victoria watched him ride away, the basket of preserves clutched to her chest like a shield. Or perhaps, she thought with sudden clarity, like a promise. Wednesday arrived with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching as Victoria alternated between anticipation and anxiety. By mid-afternoon, she had cleaned her modest home from top to bottom, prepared a venison stew that simmered fragrantly on the stove, and changed her dress 3 times. She had finally settled on a deep blue cotton dress with a lace collar still somber enough to acknowledge her widow's status, but not the full black mourning she had worn since Thomas's death. The small deviation from strict mourning protocol felt both transgressive and liberating. At 5:15, Victoria stood before her small mirror, pinning up her dark auburn hair with trembling fingers. It had been so long since she had entertained a caller, particularly a male one, that she felt as nervous as a girl at her first dance. "This is ridiculous," she told her reflection firmly. "It's only dinner with a neighbor, a kind man who understands loss, nothing more." Yet even as she spoke the words, Victoria knew they weren't entirely true. There was something about Jake McCord that stirred feelings she had thought long buried in awareness that went beyond mere friendship or neighborly goodwill. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard pulled her from her thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Victoria smoothed her skirts and went to the door. Jake had arrived on horseback rather than by wagon, riding the same chestnut stallion from their previous encounter. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and he wore a crisp white shirt under a brown leather vest. A small bouquet of wildflowers was clutched somewhat awkwardly in his hand. He dismounted as Victoria stepped onto the porch, securing Thunder to the hitching post with practiced ease before approaching the steps. "Evening, Victoria," he greeted her, his smile warm. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "As do you, clean up quite nicely for a rancher." Jake laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Don't tell my hands, they think I sleep in my work clothes and hat." He extended the wildflowers. "These aren't much compared to what you could find in any city flower shop, but I thought you might like them all the same." Victoria accepted the bouquet, touched by the gesture. Prairie daisies, black-eyed Susans, and delicate blue columbines were tied with a simple piece of twine. "They're beautiful," she said sincerely. "Thank you. Please come in while I put these in water." Jake followed her into the small house, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Victoria was suddenly aware of how he seemed to fill the modest space not imposingly, but with a solid, reassuring presence. "Something smells wonderful," he commented as Victoria found a mason jar to serve as a vase for the flowers. "Venison stew," she replied. "I hope you don't mind." "It's one of the few recipes I've truly mastered." "Mind. I've been living on my own cooking and whatever my ranch cook manages to throw together," Jake said with a grin. "Anything homemade that isn't burned on the bottom is a feast as far as I'm concerned." Victoria laughed, arranging the wildflowers in the makeshift vase. "Well, I can promise it isn't burned. Though I should warn you, I used Mrs. Jenkins' sourdough starter for the bread, and I'm not entirely sure I did it justice." "I'll be the judge of that," Jake said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I've eaten enough of Martha's bread at town socials to know the real thing." The easy banter continued as Victoria served the meal at her small kitchen table. To her relief, Jake seemed genuinely appreciative of her cooking, accepting a second helping of stew with enthusiasm and pronouncing her bread a fine first effort with Martha's legendary starter. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. Jake told her about his ranch, 8,000 acres of prime grazing land that he had built from almost nothing over the past 7 years. Victoria shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, where her father had been a moderately successful merchant before losing everything in bad investments. "Is that why you married an older man?" Jake asked, his tone curious but not judgmental. For security after your father's losses, the directness of the question might have offended Victoria from someone else, but Jake's straightforward manner made it seem natural. "Partly," she admitted. William was kind, established. My mother had died years before, and when father followed shortly after their financial ruin. William offered stability when I had none. And your second husband, Thomas, was it? Victoria nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. Thomas was different. I married him 2 years after William died. He was passionate, ambitious. I think I was drawn to his energy, his certainty about the future. She smiled sadly. Ironic that his certainty proved so unfounded. Life has a way of appending our most careful plans, Jake agreed. When I came west, I never imagined owning a cattle ranch. I was a surveyor for the railroad. Had my life all mapped out, you might say. What changed? Victoria asked. Jake's expression grew distant. Rebecca. Met her in a small town in Kansas. She was the station master's daughter. Most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, with the quickest mind and sharpest tongue. His smile turned bittersweet. Changed all my plans in an instant. We married within 3 months. Moved to Colorado to start fresh away from the railroad. And after she died, Victoria asked softly. I was lost for a long time, Jake admitted. Drank too much. Took risks no sensible man would take. Then one day I was riding through this valley and saw the land that would become my ranch. Something clicked into place. I knew this was where I needed to be. Victoria nodded, understanding completely. That's how I felt when I saw this place, she said. It was run down, neglected, but something about it spoke to me, as though it needed someone to care for it as much as I needed somewhere to pour my energy. Exactly, Jake agreed, his blue eyes warming as they met hers across the table. Some places just feel right, don't they? Like they've been waiting for you. The moment stretched between them, filled with an unspoken connection that made Victoria's heart beat faster. She broke eye contact first, rising to clear the dishes. Would you like coffee? I'm afraid I don't have anything stronger to offer. Coffee would be perfect, Jake said, standing to help her gather the plates despite her protests. They settled into a companionable rhythm, Jake washing the dishes while Victoria dried them and put them away. The domestic intimacy of the task felt both strange and familiar, as though they had done this together many times before. With the kitchen tidied, they moved to Victoria's small sitting room. The evening had cooled and Victoria had lit a fire in the hearth earlier, giving the room a warm, golden glow. You've made this place your own, Jake observed, looking around at the modest but comfortable furnishings. A bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with well-worn volumes. Beside the window, a small desk held writing materials and what appeared to be ledgers. Do you read all of these? He asked, gesturing to the books. Victoria nodded. Reading has always been my escape, she admitted. When reality becomes too harsh, books offer a different world to inhabit for a time. Jake approached the bookshelf, scanning the titles. Dickens, Austen, Thoreau, he read. And is that Homer? In Greek, Victoria smiled, surprised by his recognition. Yes. A gift from my father when I was 16. He believed in education for women, which was somewhat unusual for his generation. A man ahead of his time, Jake commented. My mother taught school before she married, insisted I learn Latin and Greek alongside more practical skills. My father thought it was a waste for a boy who'd likely work with his hands, but he indulged her. And was it a waste? Victoria asked, curious. Jake smiled. Not at all. I've found use for every bit of learning life has offered, formal or otherwise. He selected a volume from the shelf, a collection of Whitman's poetry. May I? At Victoria's nod, he opened the book, turning pages until he found what he sought. Not till the sun excludes you do I exclude you, he read, his deep voice giving the words a resonance that sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. Not till the waters refuse to glisten for you and the leaves to rustle for you, do my words refuse to glisten and rustle for you." He closed the book gently, returning it to its place. Whitman understands something essential about life, I think, about how interconnected we all are with each other and with the natural world. Victoria stared at him, momentarily speechless. This was not what she had expected from a cattle rancher, no matter how kind or understanding he had shown himself to be. "You continue to surprise me, Jake McCord," she said finally. He laughed softly. "Good. Predictability is the enemy of a full life in my experience." They talked for hours as the fire burned low in the grate. Jake told her about growing up in Ohio, the son of a blacksmith who had instilled in him a love of craftsmanship and an appreciation for hard work. Victoria shared memories of her mother, a gentle woman with a talent for music who had taught Victoria to play the piano before consumption claimed her when Victoria was just 12. It was well past 11 when Jake reluctantly stood to leave. "I've kept you up far too late," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't truly sorry for it. "I've enjoyed every minute," Victoria replied honestly as she walked him to the door. On the porch, Jake turned to face her, his expression serious in the silver moonlight. "Victoria," he began, "I'd like to see you again, regularly if you're amenable." The formal phrasing made her smile. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "The town will talk," he warned, though his eyes suggested this concerned him far less than it might concern her. Victoria considered this, then straightened her shoulders. "Let them," she said with sudden conviction. "I've lived my life according to others' expectations for too long. I find I no longer have the patience for it." Jake's smile was slow and warm. "That's the kind of grit I mentioned when we first met," he said. "The kind this territory needs." He hesitated, then slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Victoria Winters," he murmured. "Thank you for a wonderful evening." Victoria's cheek tingled where his lips had touched her skin. "Good night, Jake," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She watched as he mounted Thunder and rode away, lifting his hand in farewell as he reached the edge of her property. Long after he had disappeared from sight, Victoria remained on the porch, her fingers touching the spot where he had kissed her, a smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The following week saw Jake becoming a regular visitor at Victoria's small homestead. He came first on Sundays after she returned from church, then added Wednesday evenings as well. Each visit strengthened the connection between them, a bond built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and a growing affection that neither could deny. As June gave way to July, the summer heat intensified, baking the land and turning the grass a golden brown except where irrigation kept it green. Victoria's garden flourished under her careful tending, and the apple trees in her orchard grew heavy with fruit that would soon be ready for harvest. True to his word, Jake had sent 2 of his ranch hands to help repair her barn roof and shore up the chicken coop against predators. The men had worked efficiently under his direction, treating Victoria with a respect that reflected their boss's attitude. In town, Victoria noticed a subtle shift in how she was received. While some still whispered behind their hands when she passed, others like Martha Jenkins and her husband now greeted her openly. Even Mr. Goldsmith at the general store had begun to engage her in conversation when she made her weekly purchases, asking after her garden and commenting on the weather. She had no illusions about the reason for this change. Jake McCord was well respected in Copper Creek, a successful rancher who employed many local men and dealt fairly with everyone. His obvious interest in Victoria had forced the town to reconsider their judgment of her. It was on a particularly warm afternoon in late July that Jake arrived unexpectedly at Victoria's home, driving a light buggy rather than riding horseback, as was his usual custom. "I've come to kidnap you," he announced with a grin as Victoria met him in the yard, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been making preserves from the berries she had picked that morning, and her kitchen was sweltering. "Kidnap me," she repeated, laughing despite her surprise. "On what grounds, sir?" "On the grounds that it's too hot to be inside making preserves, and there's a perfect swimming hole about 2 miles from here that's going to waste," Jake replied. "I've packed a picnic lunch and I promise to have you back before sundown." Victoria hesitated, though the idea was tempting. "I don't know, Jake, it's hardly proper." "I've brought Lisa along as chaperone," he assured her, gesturing to the buggy where his ranch cook's daughter, a girl of about 16, sat waiting. "She's been dying for a swim herself. Her mother said it was fine as long as we had her back by evening milking time." The thoughtfulness of this arrangement touched Victoria. Jake had clearly anticipated her concerns about propriety and addressed them in a way that would allow her to accept his invitation without reservation. "Give me 10 minutes to change and secure the house," she said, making up her mind. Jake's grin widened. "I'll be waiting right here." 15 minutes later they were on their way, Victoria wearing her lightest summer dress and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her fair skin from the sun. Lisa chattered happily from the back seat of the buggy, filling them in on all the ranch gossip and expressing her delight at the unexpected holiday from her duties in the kitchen. The swimming hole proved to be everything Jake had promised: a deep, clear pool formed by a bend in the creek that ran through his property. Cottonwood trees provided dappled shade, and a small sandy beach offered a perfect spot for their picnic. Lisa had brought her swimming clothes, as had Jake. Victoria, not having anticipated such an outing, was content to wade ankle-deep in the cool water while the others swam. She sat on the sandy bank, her skirts tucked modestly around her legs, watching as Jake taught Lisa how to float on her back. There was something deeply appealing about seeing this side of him: patient, playful, at ease in the water and the sunshine. His wet hair curled against his neck, and water droplets glistened on his tan shoulders. Victoria found herself admiring the strength evident in his arms and back, then blushed at the direction of her thoughts. After their swim, Jake spread the picnic blanket in the shade while Lisa and Victoria unpacked the food his cook had prepared: fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and a jar of lemonade that had been cooling in the creek. "This is absolute heaven," Victoria sighed after they had eaten their fill, leaning back on her elbows to gaze up at the leaves rustling overhead. "Thank you for kidnapping me, Jake. I didn't realize how much I needed this." "You work too hard," he observed, stretching out beside her on the blanket while Lisa dozed a few feet away. "Everyone needs a day of leisure now and then," says the man who runs an 8,000-acre cattle ranch, Victoria teased, turning her head to look at him. Jake chuckled. "Fair point. But even I take a day off occasionally. Usually when someone wiser than me points out that I'm becoming a bear to be around." "And who might that be?" Victoria asked, curious. "My foreman, Joe Santiago. Been with me since I bought the place. Knows me better than I know myself sometimes." Jake plucked a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. "He's the one who suggested I might be happier if I spent more time away from the ranch these past few weeks." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks. "And are you happier?" Jake's blue eyes met hers, serious now despite his relaxed posture. "Happier than I've been in 7 years," he said simply. The honesty of his answer stole Victoria's breath. "Jake," she began, uncertain what to say in the face of such a declaration. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her, correctly reading her hesitation. "I just wanted you to know. Being with you, getting to know you these past weeks, it's woken something in me that I thought was long dead." Victoria understood exactly what he meant. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I would live out my days alone, just trying to survive from one day to the next. And now," Jake prompted gently, "now I find myself looking forward to tomorrow," Victoria said. "Planning for next season's garden, thinking about how the apples might sell at market, whether I should expand the chicken coop." She smiled. "Living rather than just surviving." Jake reached out, his hand covering hers on the blanket. "I'm glad," he said simply. They might have said more, but Lisa chose that moment to wake from her nap, stretching and asking if there was any lemonade left. The intimate moment passed, but the understanding between them remained, a silent acknowledgement of feelings growing too strong to ignore. The ride back to Victoria's homestead was filled with comfortable conversation and occasional laughter, as Lisa regaled them with stories of her many siblings' antics. Jake kept the horses at an easy pace, clearly in no hurry to end their day together. As they approached Victoria's property, however, she noticed a wagon parked in her yard, one she didn't recognize. A man in a dark suit stood on her porch, peering through the windows with his hands cupped around his eyes. "Were you expecting visitors?" Jake asked, his tone suddenly cautious. "No," Victoria replied, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. "I don't recognize him or the wagon." Jake clicked to the horses, urging them to a faster pace. As they drew nearer, the man on the porch turned at the sound of their approach. He was middle-aged, with a thin mustache and spectacles that glinted in the late afternoon sun. "Mrs. Winters," he called as Jake drew the buggy to a halt in the yard. "Victoria Winters." "Yes," Victoria replied cautiously, allowing Jake to help her down from the buggy. "And you are?" "Harold Pinkerton," the man said, descending the porch steps and extending his hand. "Of Pinkerton and Associates, attorneys at law, Denver." Victoria's pulse quickened. Thomas had worked with Pinkerton's firm occasionally. "What brings you all the way to Copper Creek, Mr. Pinkerton?" The attorney glanced at Jake and Lisa, his expression suggesting he would prefer a private conversation. Victoria, sensing his hesitation, made a quick decision. "This is Mr. McCord, my neighbor, and Miss Lisa Thompson," she introduced them. "Whatever business brings you here, you may speak freely in front of them." Pinkerton nodded, though he still seemed somewhat uncomfortable. "Very well. Mrs. Winters, I've been attempting to locate you for several months. When your husband's estate was finally settled, there were complications that required your attention." "Complications," Victoria repeated, confused. "I was under the impression that Thomas left very little. The house in Denver barely covered his medical debts." "That is partially correct," Pinkerton acknowledged. "However, shortly before his death, Mr. Winters made an investment on your behalf, one that has recently proven quite lucrative." Victoria stared at the attorney, trying to process this information. "What sort of investment?" "Mining shares," Pinkerton explained, "in a silver claim near Leadville. At the time, they were considered high risk, but Mr. Winters was convinced of their potential. He purchased them in your name only, perhaps anticipating his own demise." "And these shares are now valuable?" Victoria asked, still struggling to understand the implications. "Extremely," Pinkerton confirmed. "The mine struck a rich vein 3 months ago. Your shares are currently valued at approximately $30,000, Mrs. Winters, and likely to increase in value as production continues." Victoria felt her knees weaken. $30,000 was an almost unimaginable sum of fortune that would secure her future beyond any doubt. "I require your signature on several documents," Pinkerton continued, reaching into his satchel. and to discuss how you wish to manage this unexpected windfall. Victoria glanced at Jake, who had remained silent throughout this exchange. His expression was unreadable, his blue eyes fixed on her face rather than on the attorney or the documents he was now extracting from his case. "Mr. Pinkerton," Victoria said, making a sudden decision, "you've had a long journey. Would you be so kind as to join us for dinner? We can discuss the details afterward." The attorney looked momentarily surprised but quickly recovered. "Of course, Mrs. Winters, that would be most agreeable." "Jake, would you and Lisa care to stay as well?" Victoria asked, turning to them. "I believe I have enough food to stretch for 4. "I should get Lisa back to her mother," Jake said, his tone carefully neutral, "but thank you for the invitation." To Pinkerton, he added, "The Rusty Nail in town has clean rooms if you need accommodation for the night." "Thank you, Mr. McCord," the attorney replied with a nod. An awkward silence fell, broken only when Lisa spoke up. "Thank you for a lovely day, Mrs. Winters," she said, her young face serious. "I had ever so much fun." "So did I, Lisa," Victoria replied warmly. "Thank you for accompanying us." Jake helped the girl back into the buggy, then turned to Victoria. "I'll check in on you tomorrow," he said quietly, "if that's all right." "Please do," Victoria said, suddenly anxious that he might misinterpret her newfound wealth as a reason to withdraw. "I'd like that very much." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. With a tip of his hat to Pinkerton, he climbed into the buggy and took up the reins. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, and turned the horses toward the road. Victoria watched him go, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. The day that had started so perfectly had taken an unexpected turn, one that would undoubtedly change her life in ways she couldn't yet foresee. "Shall we, Mrs. Winters?" Pinkerton prompted, gesturing toward the house. "Yes, of course," Victoria replied, tearing her gaze from Jake's retreating figure. "Please come inside, Mr. Pinkerton. I believe we have much to discuss." The following morning dawned clear and bright, but Victoria had been awake long before the sun rose. After Mr. Pinkerton's departure, the previous evening armed with her signatures on various legal documents and instructions regarding her new financial affairs, she had found sleep elusive. $30,000. The figure kept repeating in her mind as she moved through her morning chores. It was enough to buy a much larger property, to travel, to live comfortably without working for the rest of her life, if she managed it wisely. Yet as she fed her chickens and watered her garden, Victoria found herself strangely ambivalent about this unexpected windfall. The money represented security, certainly something she had sought all her life, but it also represented choices she hadn't anticipated having to make. By mid-morning, she had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation, watching the road for signs of Jake's approach. When he finally appeared, riding thunder at an unhurried pace, Victoria's heart leapt in her chest despite her anxiety. He dismounted in the yard, securing the horse to the hitching post before approaching the porch where Victoria waited. His expression was carefully neutral, though his eyes searched her face as if looking for answers to unasked questions. "Good morning," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Not at all," Victoria assured him. "Would you like coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Jake nodded, following her into the kitchen. They moved in awkward silence, so different from their usual easy companionship that Victoria felt a pang of loss. When they were seated at the table, mugs of steaming coffee before them, Jake finally spoke. "So, $30,000. Victoria nodded, wrapping her hands around her mug. "It seems Thomas made one final gesture of care," she said softly, "though I had no idea until yesterday." "It's a life-changing sum," Jake observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Victoria agreed. Mr. Pinkerton has arranged for the money to be transferred to a bank in Denver. He suggested I might want to relocate to a larger town, perhaps even back to Denver itself, where I could make better use of such resources. Jake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. And is that what you want, to return to city life? Victoria shook her head without hesitation. No. I've grown to love it here, she said simply. The peace, the connection to the land, the freedom to build something of my own. The tension in Jake's shoulders eased slightly. Your orchard is just starting to come into its own, he said. It would be a shame to abandon it now. That's what I told Mr. Pinkerton, Victoria replied, a small smile playing at her lips. He seemed to think I was being sentimental rather than practical. City lawyers rarely understand the value of things that can't be measured in dollars, Jake said, his own smile returning. So you'll stay then? I'll stay, Victoria confirmed, though I may make some improvements to the property. The house needs a new roof before winter, and I've been thinking about expanding the orchard next spring. Jake nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. A comfortable silence fell between them, the awkwardness of earlier moments fading. I was worried, Jake admitted after a time, his blue eyes meeting hers across the table, that your newfound wealth might change things between us. Why would it? Victoria asked, genuinely puzzled. Jake's laugh held little humor. Rich widows don't typically socialize with cattle ranchers, Victoria, at least not with serious intent. Is that what we've been doing? She asked, her heart beating faster. Socializing with serious intent. Jake set down his mug, his expression suddenly vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. You know, it's been more than that, he said quietly. At least for me. Victoria reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. For me as well, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The relief that flooded Jake's face was almost palpable. I was half convinced you'd be on the next stage to Denver, he confessed. That yesterday was our goodbye, whether you knew it or not. Is that why you left so abruptly? Victoria asked, understanding dawning. Jake nodded. I didn't trust myself to stay and watch you make plans for a future that might not include me, he admitted. Cowardly, perhaps, but self-preservation has its merits. Victoria squeezed his hand. I have no intention of leaving Copper Creek, she assured him, or of changing anything about my life that brings me happiness. She paused, gathering her courage. Including you, Jake McCord. The smile that broke across his face was like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds. That's good to hear, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Because I find myself increasingly unable to imagine my life without you in it, Victoria Winters. The simple declaration, spoken without embellishment or pretense, touched Victoria deeply. I feel the same way, she admitted, though I've been afraid to acknowledge it even to myself. Afraid. Jake prompted gently. Of what? Victoria withdrew her hand, wrapping her fingers once more around her coffee mug. Of losing someone else I care for, she said softly. Of being hurt again. Of being judged for moving forward with my life. All understandable fears, Jake acknowledged. I've had similar thoughts myself. After Rebecca died, I swore I'd never put myself in a position to feel that kind of pain again. What changed your mind? Victoria asked. Jake's smile was gentle. You did, he said simply. From that first day in Goldsmith's store, when you stood there with your head high despite the whispers, when I saw your strength, your dignity in the face of the town's judgment, something shifted inside me. Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. And when you said I was strong enough for you, I meant it, Jake assured her. I still do. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Victoria, and I find I've fallen in love with that strength along with everything else about you. The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Victoria's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "I've fallen in love with you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. "Though I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself." Jake reached across the table, taking both her hands in his. "We can take this as slowly as you need," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Victoria smiled through the tears that now spilled freely down her cheeks. "I've learned that life is too short and too unpredictable for unnecessary delays," she said. "I don't want to waste any more time being afraid of happiness." Jake's answering smile was radiant. "In that case," he said, rising from his chair and moving around the table to kneel beside her, still holding her hands, "I have something to ask you." Victoria's breath caught as she realized his intent. "Jake." "Victoria Winters," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I know it hasn't been long and some might say we're rushing, but when you've lost as much as we have, I think you recognize the real thing when you find it again." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Time seemed to suspend as Victoria looked into Jake's earnest face. In his eyes, she saw everything she had ever wanted: respect, understanding, partnership, and above all, a love that accepted her completely, past and all. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain despite her tears. "Yes, Jake McCord, I will marry you." With a sound that was half laugh, half sob, Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he never intended to let go. When their lips finally met, it was with the sweetness of a promise long awaited and the passion of a love both had thought never to find again. Word of their engagement spread through Copper Creek with predictable speed. By Sunday, when Victoria entered the church with Jake at her side, every eye in the congregation followed their progress to a pew midway down the aisle. Reverend Simmons' sermon that day focused on redemption and second chances, a choice that seemed pointed enough to make Victoria wonder if the good Reverend was more perceptive than she had given him credit for. Jake, seated beside her in a proper suit rather than his usual ranch clothes, squeezed her hand discreetly as the Reverend expounded on God's infinite capacity for renewal. After the service, Martha Jenkins was the first to approach them, her round face beaming with genuine pleasure. "I couldn't be happier for you both," she declared, embracing Victoria warmly. "When's the wedding to be?" "Next month," Jake answered, his arms settling comfortably around Victoria's waist. "Just a small ceremony, but we'd be honored if you and Robert would attend." "Wild horses couldn't keep us away," Martha assured them. "And I'm making the cake, no arguments." As Martha moved away, others approached, some with sincere congratulations, others with more reserved good wishes that nonetheless represented a significant improvement over the cold shoulders Victoria had received in the past. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had led some of the most persistent whispering campaigns against Victoria, offered a stiff nod and a murmured best wishes before moving on. "Progress," Jake murmured in Victoria's ear, his breath warm against her skin. Victoria smiled, leaning slightly into his solid presence beside her. "Indeed," she agreed, "though I find I care less and less what they think." "That's my girl," Jake said, his voice warm with pride. The month leading up to their wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Victoria used a portion of her newfound wealth to order a proper wedding dress from Denver, a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Elegant without being ostentatious. Jake, for his part, focused on preparing his ranch house for Victoria's arrival. The sprawling structure, built of solid logs with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides, had been functional but Spartan since Rebecca's death. Now, with Victoria's input, It was being transformed into a true home once more. Fresh paint brightened the interior walls, new curtains hung at the windows, and furniture that had long been stored in unused rooms was brought out, polished, and arranged to create welcoming spaces. Jake had even ordered a piano from Denver as a wedding gift, remembering Victoria's mention of her mother teaching her to play. On the morning of their wedding day, Victoria woke in her small farmhouse for the last time as a single woman. Martha Jenkins and her 2 daughters arrived early to help her prepare, bringing flowers from Martha's garden and a breakfast basket that ensured Victoria would not face her wedding day on an empty stomach. "Every bride needs proper sustenance," Martha declared as she arranged Victoria's hair in an elegant chignon. "Can't have you fainting at the altar, especially not with your history. Town would never stop talking." The joke, spoken with obvious affection, made Victoria laugh rather than take offense. "Heaven forbid we give them more to gossip about," she agreed. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Winters," Martha's eldest daughter said shyly as Victoria stood in her wedding gown, ready at last. "Thank you, Sarah," Victoria replied, smoothing the silk skirts with trembling hands. "And soon it will be Mrs. McCord." "A fine name," Martha approved, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers that crowned Victoria's dark auburn hair. "And Jake McCord is a fine man. You've both been blessed to find each other after such sorrow." Victoria blinked back sudden tears. "Yes," she agreed softly, "we have indeed." The ceremony took place at the church, with Reverend Simmons officiating with more warmth than Victoria had previously experienced from him. The small building was filled to capacity not only with the curious, but with many who had come to genuinely wish the couple well. Jake's ranch hands occupied several pews, scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best, their weathered faces beaming with pleasure for their boss. Lisa Thompson sat with her parents near the front, fairly bursting with excitement at having played a small role in the courtship. When Victoria entered on the arm of Robert Jenkins, who had graciously offered to give her away, she had eyes only for Jake. He stood at the altar, tall and handsome in a new black suit, his blue eyes finding hers immediately. The love and admiration in his gaze as she walked toward him gave Victoria a confidence she had never known before. By the time she reached his side, her earlier nervousness had vanished, replaced by a serene certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Simmons began, his voice ringing through the hushed church, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over Victoria like a blessing as she stood hand in hand with Jake. When it came time for their vows, Jake's voice was clear and unwavering, his promises spoken with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "I, Jacob Daniel McCord, take thee, Victoria Ann Winters, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he recited, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Victoria's own voice trembled slightly as she repeated the sacred words, overcome by the magnitude of the moment and the journey that had brought them to it. "With this ring, I thee wed," Jake said, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger, a band that symbolized not the beginning of their story, but a continuation of 2 lives that had known both joy and profound sorrow. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Simmons concluded after Victoria had placed a matching band on Jake's finger, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He smiled, more warmly than Victoria had ever seen from him. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. McCord." Jake needed no further encouragement. His kiss was gentle but thorough, a promise of the life they would build together and a celebration of the love they had found when neither expected to love again. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Victoria felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The applause and cheers that greeted them spoke of genuine goodwill, a far cry from the whispers and judgments that had followed her arrival in Copper Creek. The reception that followed at the Diamondback Ranch was a true Western celebration. Tables laden with food stretched across the wide lawn, a platform had been constructed for dancing, and lanterns hung from trees promised illumination once darkness fell. Victoria changed from her wedding gown into a simpler dress of pale blue silk, still elegant, but more practical for the festivities ahead. When she emerged from the house to rejoin the celebration, Jake was waiting at the bottom of the veranda steps, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Mrs. McCord," he greeted her, extending his hand. "Mr. McCord," she returned, placing her fingers in his. He drew her close, his arms settling comfortably around her waist. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Completely," Victoria assured him, leaning into his solid warmth. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible again," Jake admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. As the afternoon turned to evening, they danced beneath the open sky, accepted congratulations from what seemed like the entire town, and cut Martha Jenkins' magnificent three-tiered cake to appreciative applause. When the last guest had departed and the ranch hands had dispersed to their quarters, Jake led Victoria into their home now, truly. The piano he had ordered stood in the front parlor, its polished surface gleaming in the lamplight. "A wedding gift," he explained as Victoria ran her fingers reverently over the keys. "I thought perhaps you might teach our children someday, as your mother taught you." The simple statement, spoken with such certainty and hope, brought tears to Victoria's eyes. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Jake drew her into his arms, his expression serious now. "I can't promise there won't be hard times ahead," he said softly. "Life has a way of throwing challenges at us when we least expect them." "I know," Victoria acknowledged, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "But we'll face them together. That makes all the difference." "Together," Jake agreed, tipping her face up to his. "Always." Their kiss sealed the promise, a testament to the strength they had found in each other and the love that had blossomed when neither expected to love again. 5 years later, Victoria sat on the wide veranda of the ranch house, watching as Jake chased their 3-year-old son, William, across the lawn. Their daughter, Rebecca, just turned 1, sat on Victoria's lap, clapping her chubby hands in delight at her father and brother's antics. "Papa fast." William shrieked as Jake pretended to struggle to catch him. "Too fast for me," Jake agreed, dramatically collapsing onto the grass. "You win, Cowboy." William immediately pounced on his father's chest, his peals of laughter carrying across the yard. "Got you, Papa." Victoria smiled, bouncing Rebecca gently on her knee. The years had brought changes to the Diamondback Ranch, a new wing added to the house. The cattle operation expanded, the business thriving under Jake's careful management. Victoria's own orchard had grown as well, now covering 20 acres and producing apples that were shipped as far as Denver. The preserves and cider she made each fall had developed a reputation that extended well beyond Copper Creek, and she employed several local women to help with the seasonal work. Her widow's fortune remained largely untouched, invested wisely for their children's future. The security it provided was a comfort, but Victoria had discovered that true wealth lay in the life. She and Jake had built together a life rich in love, purpose, and the quiet joy of everyday moments shared. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake carried a tired William up the steps to join them on the veranda. The boy immediately curled into Victoria's side, his small hand reaching out to pat his sister's foot. "Ready for bed, Cowboy?" Jake asked, ruffling his son's dark hair. "Story first," William insisted around a yawn. "The one about Mama being strong." Victoria exchanged a smile with Jake. It had become William's favorite bedtime story, the tale of how his parents had found each other, carefully edited for young ears but preserving the essential truth of their journey. "All right," Jake agreed, taking Rebecca from Victoria's arms so she could stand. "One story, then sleep." As they made their way inside, the children's rooms warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk, Victoria felt the familiar rush of gratitude that had become a constant undercurrent in her life. The path that had led her here had not been easy or straightforward, but every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to bring her to this place of profound contentment. Later, with the children asleep and the house quiet around them, Victoria and Jake sat together on the veranda, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. McCord," Jake said softly, raising his glass of whiskey in a toast. "Happy anniversary, Mr. McCord," Victoria returned, touching her own glass to his. 5 years. "The best 5 years of my life," Jake said with simple honesty. "Though I'm aiming for at least 40 more," Victoria laughed. "Ambitious," she teased, "but I approve of the plan." Jake set his glass aside, taking her hand in his. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his expression serious in the fading light. "Taking a chance on a rough cattleman when you could have returned to city life as a wealthy widow?" Victoria shook her head, squeezing his fingers. "Not for a single moment," she assured him. "You saw me when others looked away. You valued my strength when others feared it." She leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. "You gave me a life I never dared to dream of, Jake McCord." "We gave it to each other," Jake corrected, drawing her closer until she was nestled against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. "And I'm grateful for it every day." As darkness settled fully over the Diamondback Ranch, Victoria closed her eyes, surrounded by the sounds of the home they had created together, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft creak of the porch swing, the steady rhythm of Jake's heart beneath her ear. Once, she had been defined by Loss the widow, the woman twice bereaved, an object of suspicion and whispered judgment. Now, she was simply Victoria McCord, wife, mother, orchardist, a woman whose strength had been recognized and celebrated by the man who held her heart. It was, she reflected as Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders, exactly as he had said that first day in the general store. She had been strong enough for him, and he for her. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, a love that honored their pasts while embracing their future, as vast and promising as the western sky above them.